Daniel had never expected to inherit anything from his uncle, let alone an old cabin tucked away in the woods. His uncle, Harold, had always been a quiet man, living alone and keeping to himself. To everyone else, the cabin seemed like nothing more than an old, forgotten building. Neighbors whispered that it was falling apart, overrun with weeds and barely standing. Even Daniel's friends laughed when he mentioned it. "Why would you want that old thing?" they asked. "It's just a pile of wood and memories. You'll regret it." At first, Daniel tried to ignore their teasing. After all, it wasn't about money or prestige. The cabin was a part of his family, and there was something about the idea of it that pulled at him. He remembered visiting as a child, running through the woods with Harold following behind, calling him back before he wandered too far. Those memories, though faint, were warm and comforting. Maybe he thought the cabin was worth a closer look. So one crisp morning in early spring, Daniel packed his old backpack, loaded up his small car, and drove toward the edge of town where the forest began. As the town disappeared behind him, the roads became narrow, winding and lined with tall, dense trees. Birds chirped, and the sun filtered through the branches, making the road ahead look almost magical. It was peaceful in a way Daniel hadn't experienced in years. When he finally arrived, the cabin came into view. It looked smaller than he remembered, more fragile. The wooden walls were gray with age, and the roof sagged slightly in the middle. Windows were dusty, and the front door had a rusty lock dangling from its hinges. The yard was overgrown, with grass taller than his knees and bushes creeping close to the house. But Daniel didn't feel disappointment. Instead, he felt curiosity and a strange kind of excitement. He stepped out of the car, his boots crunching on the gravel path. He approached the cabin slowly, noticing the way the wind caused the old wooden panels to creak. The smell of earth, pine, and old wood filled his nose. As he reached the porch, he noticed the small details he hadn't remembered. A carved railing, chipped paint revealing layers of past colors, and Harold's initials etched into one of the posts. These little marks told stories that made the cabin feel alive, almost like it was waiting for him. Daniel pushed the door open, and it groaned loudly as if complaining about being disturbed after so many years. Inside, dust floated in the sunlight streaming through the broken windows. Cobwebs hung from the corners, and the floor was littered with old leaves and debris. It smelled of mustiness, wood, and something faintly sweet, like the memory of old family gatherings. He had imagined it differently, but it was still comforting in its own strange way. He explored the rooms carefully. The living room had a fireplace with a mantel still holding a few scattered ashes. Chairs sat askew, and a small wooden table had scratches from years of use. The kitchen was tiny, with cupboards that had warped over time and a sink that hadn't seen running water in decades. Upstairs, the bedrooms were dark and quiet. One of the beds had a thin mattress, yellowed with age, and an old trunk rested at the foot. Every corner of the cabin seemed frozen in time, untouched since Harold's last days. As Daniel moved through the cabin, he thought about his uncle. Harold had always been a man of few words, but he had cared deeply about this place. He remembered Harold laughing once about how the cabin held more secrets than anyone could imagine. Daniel had dismissed it then as an exaggeration. But standing here in the quiet of the empty rooms, he began to wonder if there might be some truth to those words. That evening, Daniel lit a small lantern he had brought with him and sat on the old porch, listening to the wind rustle through the trees. He could hear owls calling in the distance and the soft hoot of a night bird somewhere close by. It was peaceful, almost like the cabin had its own rhythm, separate from the world outside. He sipped from a thermos of tea and thought about the life he wanted to build here. Maybe, just maybe, this old place wasn't useless. The first night was strange. Every creak of the floorboards and groan of the roof made him sit up in surprise. Shadows stretched across the walls, and he could hear the wind whispering through the cracks. Yet it was also calming. There was a kind of honesty in the silence, a sense that the cabin had its own personality, one that didn't judge or demand. Daniel felt a connection he hadn't expected, a connection to his uncle, to his family, and to the land itself. The next morning, he began the task of cleaning. It was slow work, moving furniture, dusting, sweeping, and checking the structure for problems. As he worked, he noticed small details he had never seen before. A loose floorboard near the corner of the living room, a faded inscription on the wall behind the kitchen cupboard, and a set of stairs that creaked more than the others. Every discovery made him more curious. What stories did this cabin hold? What memories had been left behind? Neighbors and friends kept calling to tease him. "Still living in that dump?" they asked. Daniel didn't mind their laughter. It was almost funny to think that they thought the cabin was worthless. To him, it was full of life and history. Each nail, each crack, and each board was a piece of a story waiting to be uncovered, and Daniel was determined to find out what it was. Days turned into weeks, and Daniel slowly began to feel at home. He fixed the broken windows, painted the walls in soft colors, and mended the roof where it had started to sag. Each repair brought a sense of accomplishment and pride. He even planted a small garden in the yard, imagining what it would look like in summer. With every little change, the cabin started to feel alive again. Not just a relic of the past, but a place full of potential. One afternoon, while sweeping under the bed in one of the bedrooms, Daniel noticed something unusual. The floor sounded hollow in one spot. Curious, he pressed down with his hand and realized there was a small trapdoor hidden beneath the floorboards. Heart racing, he tried to lift it, but it was stuck fast. After a few minutes of effort, he managed to open it and discovered a dark, narrow staircase leading down. He hesitated, feeling a mix of fear and excitement. Could this be one of the secrets Harold had mentioned long ago? Daniel didn't rush. He decided to wait until he had proper lights and tools before exploring further. But even sitting on the edge of that trapdoor, he felt a thrill he hadn't experienced in years. The cabin, which everyone had laughed at, was starting to reveal its true self. It was more than just an old building. It was a puzzle, a story waiting to be discovered. And Daniel knew deep down that his life was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. That night, as he lay in the old bed, the wind howling softly outside, Daniel thought about the journey ahead. The cabin had welcomed him, tested him, and now invited him to uncover its mysteries. What had seemed like an impossible inheritance was in fact a gift. A gift of discovery, of family, and of a history that had been quietly waiting for him to arrive. For the first time, he felt a true sense of purpose. The laughter of others no longer mattered. He had found something far more valuable than their approval. He had found a home and perhaps something even more extraordinary hidden within it. After the first night in the cabin, Daniel woke up feeling a strange mix of excitement and curiosity. The trapdoor under the bedroom floor had captured his imagination completely. All morning he found himself glancing at it, wondering what might be hidden below. Breakfast was a simple affair, a slice of bread, some tea, but he barely touched it, his mind spinning with thoughts of discovery. The cabin had been silent for so many years, yet now it seemed almost alive, whispering secrets only he could hear. He decided to explore more of the cabin before daring to open the trapdoor fully. Daniel moved carefully through each room, noticing details he had overlooked in his first days. The living room had a few old paintings, faded and cracked, but one in particular caught his eye. It was a small landscape of the surrounding woods painted decades ago. The colors were soft but vibrant, and in the corner he saw Harold's signature. Daniel couldn't help but smile. It was like his uncle had left a piece of himself behind in every corner of the cabin. The kitchen, though simple and aged, revealed even more clues about life long gone. Old utensils were still tucked away in drawers, and a rusty kettle sat on the stove. Daniel ran his fingers over the worn wood of the table and noticed scratches and carvings, initials, dates, and little messages left by Harold or visitors long ago. Each mark seemed like a story, frozen in time, and Daniel felt a sudden connection to every person who had once stepped into this cabin. By midday, Daniel decided it was time to focus on the outside. The yard was overgrown, but he could see the potential for a garden, a small place to grow vegetables or flowers. He cleared the weeds, discovering an old stone path leading toward the edge of the forest. It was partially hidden by fallen leaves, but it hinted at a history he didn't yet understand. He imagined his uncle walking along that path years ago, perhaps thinking quietly, or tending to the small garden he must have once loved. After a long morning of cleaning and exploring, Daniel returned to the trapdoor. He had brought a sturdy lantern this time and a crowbar to help pry it open. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted the heavy wooden cover. Dust and the faint smell of earth rose from below, making him cough. Peering into the darkness, he could see the stairs descending into a narrow cellar. The air was cool and it smelled faintly of wood and old paper. Daniel's heart raced, but he knew he had to go down. Step by step, he descended the wooden stairs, careful not to disturb anything he might not understand. The lantern cast long shadows across the walls, making the cellar look both mysterious and inviting. At the bottom, the space opened into a small square room. It was cramped but surprisingly tidy. Old trunks were stacked in the corners and shelves lined the walls holding jars, boxes, and bundles of papers. Daniel could hardly believe what he was seeing. This cellar was a hidden treasure trove, perfectly preserved by his uncle. He approached one of the trunks, its leather cracked but still sturdy. With effort, he lifted the lid and found stacks of letters carefully tied with string. Each envelope was addressed in handwriting that was neat and precise. Daniel began to read some of them, discovering that they were correspondence between his uncle and various families in the town. They spoke of struggles, joys, and secrets, stories that had been forgotten by most. Daniel realized that his uncle had been a keeper of histories, protecting memories and truths that might otherwise have been lost forever. On another shelf, he found maps and deeds, some of them quite old. They depicted plots of land around the town, some with names that were still familiar. Daniel ran his fingers over the delicate paper, noticing markings and notes in the margins. His uncle had documented everything meticulously. These maps were not just property records. They were pieces of a puzzle connecting people, places, and events over decades. Daniel felt a shiver of excitement. This cabin was far more important than anyone had imagined. As he explored, Daniel discovered journals hidden under a loose floorboard in the corner of the cellar. They belonged to Harold and chronicled his life in the cabin, his thoughts, and the small acts of kindness he had done for neighbors. One entry described a family who had lost everything in a fire, and how Harold had sheltered them until they could rebuild. Another told of a disagreement over land that had threatened to split the town, and how Harold had mediated with patience and wisdom. The cabin was not just a building. It was a witness to history. Hours passed as Daniel read and explored. He felt like he had stepped into another time, walking alongside his uncle and the people whose lives had intersected with this place. Every discovery added depth to his understanding, and he realized that the cabin had been a place of refuge, not just for families, but for stories and memories. He began to appreciate his uncle more than ever, understanding the quiet heroism of a man who had chosen to protect rather than boast about his work. Late in the afternoon, Daniel stepped outside to take a break. The forest around the cabin was quiet, save for the rustling leaves and the distant sound of a creek. Sunlight filtered through the trees, casting golden patterns on the ground. He felt a sense of peace he had never known in the city. Here, surrounded by nature and history, he understood the true value of the cabin. It was not about money or appearances. It was about connection, memory, and the responsibility to preserve what mattered. Over the next few days, Daniel settled into a rhythm. Mornings were spent exploring the cabin and its surroundings, while afternoons were dedicated to cataloging the letters, maps, and journals he had discovered. He began to make notes, carefully recording what he found and piecing together the stories. It was like solving a puzzle, and with every piece the bigger picture became clearer. The cabin was more than just a home. It was a record of life, love, and resilience. Daniel also started reaching out to people mentioned in the letters. Some were distant relatives, others were descendants of families his uncle had helped. They were surprised and grateful, many expressing emotions he had not expected. Some remembered Harold with fondness, while others were amazed that the stories had been preserved at all. Through these connections, Daniel realized that the cabin had an impact far beyond its walls. It was a bridge between generations, carrying lessons and memories that could shape the present. Evenings were quiet, but full of reflection. Daniel would sit on the porch, lantern in hand, watching the sky turn pink and orange as the sun set behind the trees. The cabin, once a place of silence and dust, now felt alive with stories and energy. Daniel felt a sense of purpose he had never known before. This was no longer just an inheritance. It was a calling. He had been entrusted with a legacy, and he intended to honor it fully. One particularly quiet night, Daniel noticed something odd near the back of the cellar. A small wooden crate tucked under a shelf seemed out of place. Unlike the other trunks and boxes, it had no lock, and the wood was strangely smooth, almost polished. Curious, he opened it and found more documents, but these were different. They contained notes on hidden areas of the forest, coded messages, and references to items that had been kept safe for reasons he could not yet understand. The mystery of the cabin deepened. Daniel realized that he had only begun to scratch the surface. The cabin was full of secrets, some waiting to be discovered, others carefully hidden. He felt a mix of excitement and responsibility. What had seemed like an ordinary inheritance was in fact extraordinary. Every day he learned more, uncovering layers of history, connection, and human kindness. The laughter of those who had mocked him seemed distant and meaningless. The cabin had revealed its true value, and Daniel was determined to uncover every secret it held. By the end of the second week, the cabin no longer felt like a relic of the past. It was a living, breathing place filled with memories, discoveries, and stories waiting to be shared. Daniel had begun to restore it with care, not just physically but emotionally, understanding that every board, every plank, every hidden corner was part of a larger story. He knew that his journey had only just begun, and that the cabin still had much to reveal. The night sky stretched above him as he sat by the fireplace, lantern glowing softly beside him. He thought about his uncle, the families who had once found refuge here, and the letters that now connected the past to the present. The cabin, once laughed at by others, had become a symbol of history, mystery, and hope. Daniel closed his eyes and smiled, ready for the next chapter of discovery, knowing that each day in the cabin would bring new lessons, new stories, and new connections he had never imagined. Daniel had been living in the cabin for several weeks now, and every day seemed to bring a new discovery. Yet the trapdoor beneath the bedroom still called to him. The small cellar was full of letters, maps, and journals, but Daniel had noticed something unusual the night before, a faint draft of cold air coming from a corner of the cellar, almost like the cabin was breathing. He couldn't ignore it. Something deeper, something hidden, seemed to be waiting for him. The morning was cool and bright, with sunlight streaming through the cracks in the roof. Daniel prepared carefully before heading to the cellar. He brought his lantern, gloves, a small hammer, and a flashlight. He wanted to be ready for anything. As he descended the stairs, the familiar scent of wood, earth, and old paper welcomed him, but Daniel felt a thrill of anticipation that made his heart race. Today he thought he might uncover something extraordinary. Daniel examined the area near the small draft he had noticed. The wall in the corner was old, but the wood looked different from the rest of the cellar. It was smoother, almost polished, as if it had been worked on separately. He tapped lightly with his hammer, listening for hollow sounds. The faintest echo returned. His pulse quickened. There was definitely something behind that wall. Carefully, he pried at the panels. Slowly, the wood gave way, revealing a narrow opening just large enough for him to squeeze through. His flashlight beam revealed a small tunnel, barely wide enough for a person to crawl. It smelled of earth, wood, and something faintly sweet like old parchment. Daniel hesitated for a moment, his mind filled with images of hidden treasures and long-lost secrets. Taking a deep breath, he crawled in. The tunnel was tight and winding. Every step required care as the dirt floor shifted slightly under his weight. The walls were lined with roots and old stones, and the air was cool and damp. Daniel could feel the excitement building. He had explored much of the cabin already, but this felt different. This was something no one else had seen for decades, maybe even longer. He felt a connection to his uncle in that moment. Imagining Harold discovering the tunnel years ago and keeping its secret safe. After what felt like an eternity of careful crawling, Daniel reached a small wooden door at the end of the tunnel. It was simple but sturdy, with no lock. The lantern cast shadows that danced across the walls, making the space feel alive. He placed his hand on the door and pushed gently. It creaked open to reveal a room unlike anything he had seen before. The chamber was small but well organized, filled with shelves and cabinets, all covered in a layer of dust that spoke of years without disturbance. On the shelves were books, scrolls, and papers, some bound in leather, others tied with string. The air was thick with the scent of old knowledge and forgotten stories. Daniel moved carefully, feeling the weight of history pressing gently on him. This was more than a cellar or a hiding place. This was a secret archive, carefully preserved by his uncle. He began to examine the contents. There were journals that detailed not only Harold's life, but also the lives of others who had interacted with the cabin over the decades. Letters described families seeking refuge, disputes that had been resolved peacefully, and small acts of kindness that had made a big difference. Daniel realized that this room held more than documents. It held the spirit of a community, carefully protected in silence. Among the shelves, he noticed an old chest, larger and more ornate than the others. It was locked, but the key was tucked in a small hook nearby. With trembling hands, Daniel unlocked it. Inside, he found artifacts, photographs, small tools, and maps marked with symbols he didn't immediately understand. There were also journals with more personal entries revealing a side of Harold that Daniel had never known. His uncle had been a guardian of not just objects but of knowledge and truth, quietly ensuring that history was preserved for future generations. Daniel spent hours in the hidden room, carefully examining each item. One journal described a plot of land that had been disputed for generations. Harold had acted as a mediator, documenting every detail and keeping the evidence safe. There were maps showing secret paths and hidden locations in the surrounding woods, places where people had once found safety during difficult times. The room was a testament to Harold's foresight and dedication. As he read, Daniel began to understand the magnitude of what he had discovered. This was not just a cabin with history. It was a place of protection, a repository of forgotten stories, and a safe space for knowledge that could have been lost forever. The room beneath the cabin connected the past and the present, and Daniel realized that he had been entrusted with a great responsibility. Every document, every artifact, every secret was a piece of a larger story waiting to be shared. He decided to organize the room, starting with the maps. He spread them across the floor, studying each one carefully. Some maps detailed the land around the cabin, while others marked areas in the town and beyond. Symbols indicated hidden spots, places where Harold had left letters, money, or tools for those who might need them. Daniel felt a thrill of discovery. His uncle had been planning for the future, ensuring that help could reach people long after he was gone. Next, Daniel turned his attention to the journals. He read entries describing events that had shaped the town, some joyous, others tragic. Families who had been forgotten were remembered in meticulous detail. Harold had written about the struggles of everyday people, recording their victories and defeats, their sorrows and celebrations. Daniel realized that this hidden room was more than a secret. It was a chronicle of life itself, preserved with care and intention. As the afternoon sun began to filter through the small window near the tunnel entrance, Daniel discovered something even more remarkable. A collection of letters tied with red ribbon contained personal stories of gratitude. People who had once sought refuge at the cabin had written to Harold, sharing how his actions had changed their lives. Some letters spoke of survival, others of hope and courage. Daniel felt a deep sense of awe and respect. His uncle had lived a quiet life, yet he had touched so many in ways that would never be forgotten. The room also contained maps and notes indicating hidden compartments in other parts of the cabin. Daniel realized that Harold had anticipated the cabin being explored, leaving clues for someone trustworthy to uncover. It was as if his uncle had known that Daniel would come one day, ready to continue his work. The idea was both comforting and inspiring. Daniel felt a sense of purpose unlike anything he had experienced before. As evening approached, Daniel reluctantly left the hidden room, carefully closing the wooden door behind him. He climbed back through the tunnel, emerging into the familiar cellar. The sense of discovery was overwhelming. The cabin had gone from being an old, forgotten building to a treasure trove of history, knowledge, and human kindness. Daniel realized that the laughter of friends and neighbors who had mocked him was meaningless. The cabin had value far beyond what anyone could see from the outside. That night, Daniel sat by the fireplace, lantern in hand, reflecting on the day's discoveries. The cabin was no longer just a home. It was a place of stories, secrets, and legacies. He thought about the families whose lives had been touched by Harold, and he felt a deep responsibility to honor that work. This hidden room, preserved in silence for decades, was a gift, a bridge connecting the past to the present. Sleep came slowly that night, filled with thoughts of what he had seen. Daniel dreamed of the cabin in its prime, bustling with people seeking shelter and guidance, and of his uncle quietly documenting it all. He woke with a renewed sense of determination. He knew that the journey was far from over. There were more secrets to uncover, more stories to tell, and more connections to make. The cabin had chosen him as its guardian, and he intended to live up to that responsibility fully. The following days were spent cataloging and preserving the items in the hidden room. Daniel created lists, took notes, and carefully stored fragile documents in protective sleeves. He wanted to ensure that nothing would be lost or damaged. The process was slow but rewarding. Each discovery added depth to his understanding of his uncle and the community he had quietly served. Daniel felt as though he was walking alongside Harold, learning from his wisdom and dedication. One morning, while examining an old ledger, Daniel noticed references to a family whose property had been lost many years ago. The letters indicated that Harold had secretly preserved their claim and documented every detail. Daniel realized that he could restore not only the property, but also the family's legacy. The implications were enormous. This cabin, once dismissed as worthless, held the power to change lives, reconnect families, and preserve history in ways Daniel had never imagined. Daniel knew that the discoveries he had made so far were only the beginning. The cabin had more secrets waiting to be uncovered, and he was ready to explore every corner. With each day, he felt a deeper connection to his uncle and to the people whose lives had been touched by this remarkable place. The laughter of those who had doubted him was now distant, replaced by a sense of purpose, wonder, and anticipation. Daniel had been living in the cabin for weeks now, and the discoveries in the hidden room had begun to weigh on his mind in unexpected ways. The documents, letters, and maps he had uncovered revealed not only his Uncle Harold's life, but the lives of countless families connected to the cabin over decades. These families had trusted Harold, leaving him with their stories, secrets, and even pieces of property that had been lost or forgotten. Now Daniel realized he held the power to restore what had been hidden for generations. The morning was bright and quiet. Birds sang from the trees, and the soft rustle of leaves reminded Daniel that life outside the cabin moved on, even as he unraveled its secrets. He made himself a cup of tea and sat on the porch, looking at the forest that stretched endlessly around the property. For days he had been thinking about the families mentioned in Harold's journals. Some of their descendants still lived nearby, while others had moved far away, their histories lost to time. Daniel felt a strong urge to connect with them, to return what had been preserved in secret for so long. He started by organizing the letters and maps. Each piece contained information about the town, the surrounding land, and the families that had relied on Harold's guidance. Some maps marked properties that had been disputed, while others indicated secret paths and safe places in the forest. Daniel realized that his uncle had not just been a caretaker of the cabin, but a quiet protector of justice and fairness. Every entry, every note, was evidence of a life dedicated to helping others without seeking recognition. After several days of careful study, Daniel decided it was time to reach out. He located the descendants of one family whose land had been wrongly taken decades ago. The letters and deeds he had found detailed the rightful ownership, and Daniel felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness as he prepared to contact them. What would they think? Would they even believe the stories he had uncovered? He reminded himself that truth had a way of shining through, no matter how long it had been hidden. Daniel wrote a careful letter, explaining who he was and how he had come to find the documents. He included copies of the deeds and a summary of what his uncle had done to preserve their family's history. Weeks passed and he received a response. The family was stunned and grateful, amazed that the property and their story had been preserved for so long. They invited Daniel to visit, eager to see the documents and hear more about Harold. Daniel felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that the cabin was more than a home. It was a bridge between the past and the present. Encouraged by this success, Daniel reached out to other families mentioned in the journals. Each encounter revealed more stories of hardship, resilience, and gratitude. Some families had faced natural disasters, others had been displaced or forgotten. Harold's careful documentation had preserved their histories, and now Daniel was helping to restore their connections. He realized that the cabin had been a lifeline, not just for people but for memory itself. The laughter of those who had mocked him earlier seemed distant and meaningless compared to the impact he was now witnessing. As he continued, Daniel also began to understand the depth of Harold's foresight. The maps and notes in the hidden room indicated areas where families had once hidden valuables, letters, or tools. Some of these items were still buried or hidden, waiting for someone to find them. Daniel carefully followed the clues, uncovering small treasures and documents that had been preserved for decades. Each discovery brought a sense of wonder and connection, as if Harold's spirit was guiding him through the cabin and the surrounding forest. The cabin itself began to change under Daniel's care. What had once been a quiet, dusty space now felt alive. The garden he had planted was growing, and the rooms were slowly being restored. Every morning, he would check on the letters, documents, and artifacts, making sure they were safe and organized. The cabin was no longer just a home. It was a living archive, a place where history was preserved and shared. Daniel felt a deep responsibility to maintain it, knowing that each day added another layer to the story. One day, while examining a set of maps in the hidden room, Daniel noticed a reference to a property that had been divided among several families decades ago. The documents indicated disputes and misunderstandings that had never been resolved. He realized that he had the information needed to bring clarity and reconciliation. Carefully, he contacted the descendants, providing copies of the maps and explaining Harold's careful records. The families were amazed and grateful, some meeting in person to discuss the restored information. Daniel felt a deep sense of pride and connection, knowing that the cabin's secrets were now making a real difference in people's lives. The more Daniel explored, the more he discovered the interconnectedness of the town and the cabin. Harold had been a quiet observer and recorder of life, noting not only legal matters but personal stories, struggles, and triumphs. Daniel found letters describing acts of kindness, hidden donations, and help given to neighbors in need. It became clear that Harold had been a silent hero, shaping the community in subtle but powerful ways. Daniel felt honored to continue this work, knowing that the cabin had entrusted him with a legacy far greater than he had ever imagined. Evenings were a time for reflection. Daniel would sit on the porch, lantern beside him, looking at the sky as it changed from blue to pink to dark. The forest around him was alive with sounds of nature, and the cabin felt peaceful yet full of purpose. He thought about the families he had helped reconnect, the secrets he had uncovered, and the lessons he had learned from his uncle. The cabin was no longer just a building. It was a symbol of hope, preservation, and the power of quiet dedication. One particular afternoon, Daniel discovered a bundle of letters tied with a red ribbon. They were from people who had visited the cabin years ago, expressing gratitude for Harold's kindness. Some letters described moments of hope during difficult times, while others recounted personal growth and new opportunities that had been made possible because of Harold's careful guidance. Daniel felt a deep emotional connection to these stories. They reminded him that even quiet actions could leave a lasting impact, shaping lives long after the moment had passed. Daniel also realized that the cabin had a role beyond preserving the past. The documents and maps could help families plan for the future. He began advising them on how to restore land, reclaim lost property, or preserve important family histories. The cabin had become a hub for knowledge, connection, and guidance. People who had once thought of it as worthless now recognized its true value. The laughter of those who had mocked Daniel was replaced by admiration and respect. As the days turned into weeks, Daniel continued to uncover more connections. Some letters mentioned distant relatives, others referenced events that had been forgotten by time. Each piece added to the larger story of the cabin and the community. Daniel felt a growing sense of responsibility. He was not just preserving history. He was actively shaping the present by restoring connections and helping people understand their past. One evening, Daniel reflected on how far he had come since inheriting the cabin. What had once been a place of dust and neglect was now a vibrant center of history, memory, and connection. He thought about Harold and the quiet dedication that had preserved all of this. Daniel realized that the cabin had chosen him as its new guardian, guiding him toward a deeper understanding of family, community, and responsibility. The cabin had changed Daniel as much as he had changed it. He had grown more patient, more observant, and more connected to the lives of others. The hidden secrets beneath the cabin had revealed not only history, but also a path forward, a way to make a positive difference in the lives of those connected to the land. Daniel felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that the laughter of others no longer mattered. The true value of the cabin was now clear to him. It was a place where the past could inform the present, and where kindness, dedication, and memory could shape the future. By the end of Part 4, Daniel had uncovered the real impact of the cabin's secrets. Families were reconnecting, property disputes were being resolved, and forgotten histories were being preserved. The cabin was no longer just an inheritance, it was a legacy. Daniel had learned that even the quietest actions could leave the most lasting impressions. and he felt honored to continue the work his uncle had begun. The laughter and doubt of others had faded into irrelevance. The cabin, with its hidden treasures and stories, had changed everything, not just for Daniel, but for an entire community. Daniel had spent months uncovering the hidden treasures and stories of the cabin, and now he felt a quiet sense of purpose he had never known before. The cabin, once mocked as worthless by friends and neighbors, had become a beacon of history, kindness, and connection. Every letter, map, and journal had revealed a story, and Daniel had carefully restored and preserved them. He realized that this inheritance was far more valuable than money. It was a legacy of care, courage, and wisdom. The mornings in the cabin had a special rhythm. Birds sang from the trees and the sunlight streamed through the cracks in the roof, casting golden patterns on the floor. Daniel would begin his day by checking the documents he had organized, making sure that everything was safe and cataloged. Then he would explore the woods around the property, following the paths and locations that his Uncle Harold had recorded decades ago. Each step in the forest felt like a journey into the past, connecting him with the families who had once found refuge here. One day, Daniel decided to invite some of the descendants to the cabin. They were the families who had been mentioned in Harold's letters and journals, those whose lives had been touched by the hidden efforts of Daniel's uncle. The cabin had become more than a home. It was now a place for connection, learning, and understanding. As people arrived, their eyes widened in surprise and awe. The old building, once laughed at for its condition, was filled with history and stories that had been carefully preserved for decades. Daniel guided the visitors through the cabin, showing them the hidden room beneath the trapdoor. He carefully opened it, revealing the shelves filled with letters, journals, maps, and artifacts. The descendants were amazed. They listened in silence as Daniel explained how his uncle had documented their family histories and safeguarded important information. Some were moved to tears, overwhelmed by the realization that someone had cared enough to protect their stories through time. As the afternoon unfolded, the cabin buzzed with conversation. Families shared their memories and stories, connecting the past with the present. Some discovered relatives they had never known existed, while others learned about acts of kindness that had shaped their family histories. Daniel felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He realized that the cabin's secrets had not only preserved history, but had created an opportunity for healing, understanding, and connection across generations. In the weeks that followed, Daniel worked tirelessly to ensure that the cabin could continue serving its purpose. He repaired broken windows, strengthened the roof, and cleaned every corner of the house. The garden he had planted flourished, with flowers and vegetables growing under his careful attention. The cabin became a symbol of life and growth, reflecting both the history it preserved and the community it now nurtured. Daniel also worked to document everything he had discovered in the hidden room. He created detailed records of the letters, maps, and journals, ensuring that future generations could access them. He reached out to local historians and community leaders, sharing the findings and emphasizing the importance of preserving this history. Slowly, the cabin began to gain recognition as a valuable part of the town's heritage. What had once been dismissed as worthless was now celebrated for its incredible significance. The more Daniel shared the cabin's secrets, the more he understood the true meaning of his uncle's work. Harold had not sought fame or recognition. He had acted quietly, ensuring that stories, property, and memories were protected. Daniel felt honored to carry on this legacy. Every family that reunited, every story that was preserved was a testament to Harold's foresight and kindness. The cabin had become a living reminder that even the smallest acts of care could leave a lasting impact. One evening, as the sun set behind the trees, Daniel sat on the porch and reflected on his journey. The laughter of friends and neighbors who had once mocked him seemed distant and unimportant. What mattered was the life he had breathed back into the cabin, the connections he had helped restore, and the stories he had uncovered. The cabin had taught him patience, respect for the past, and the power of quiet dedication. Over time, Daniel began to organize events at the cabin. Descendants, historians, and curious townspeople were invited to learn about the history preserved within its walls. Workshops were held to teach children about the importance of remembering the past and respecting those who came before them. The cabin became more than a home. It became a place for learning, understanding, and celebrating community. Daniel felt a deep sense of pride in seeing the impact it had on everyone who visited. One day, Daniel discovered a final set of letters tucked behind a shelf in the hidden room. They were addressed to him, written by Harold before he passed away. In them, Harold spoke of trust, responsibility, and hope. He explained that the cabin had been a sanctuary not just for families, but for the stories and values that shaped their lives. Harold encouraged Daniel to continue caring for the cabin, to preserve its history, and to help others understand the lessons it held. Reading these letters, Daniel felt an overwhelming sense of connection to his uncle. It was as if Harold had been guiding him all along, even from beyond the grave. The realization strengthened Daniel's resolve. He continued to catalog, organize, and preserve the cabin's contents, making sure that nothing would be lost. He began planning for the future, considering how to ensure that the cabin could serve as a historical and educational resource for generations to come. He envisioned a place where children could learn about their heritage, families could reconnect, and the lessons of the past could guide the present. As months turned into years, Daniel became known in the community as the caretaker of the cabin. People respected his dedication, and families came from far and wide to learn about the history preserved there. The cabin, once mocked and ignored, had transformed into a symbol of legacy, knowledge, and hope. Daniel felt proud of the work he had done, and he knew that his uncle would have been proud too. Evenings remained his favorite time of day. Sitting on the porch watching the sun dip behind the trees, Daniel reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The cabin had been more than an inheritance. It had been a teacher, guiding him toward understanding, responsibility, and connection. He thought of the families he had helped, the stories he had preserved, and the legacy he now carried. The laughter of those who had doubted him was now replaced by admiration, respect, and understanding. The final lesson Daniel learned was that value is not always measured in wealth or appearances. The cabin had been worth far more than anyone could see at first glance. It held history, stories, and lessons that had the power to change lives. Daniel understood that true inheritance is not always money or property. It is knowledge, responsibility, and the ability to preserve what matters. The cabin had given him all of these things and more. One late evening, Daniel walked through the hidden room, lantern in hand, reflecting on the years of discovery. He ran his fingers over the journals, letters, and maps, remembering the stories they held. Each document was a connection, a thread linking the past to the present. He realized that the cabin had become a bridge between generations, preserving the wisdom, courage, and kindness of those who had come before. Daniel felt deeply grateful for the opportunity to continue his uncle's work. As the night settled, Daniel sat by the fireplace, lantern glowing softly beside him. The cabin, once an old dusty building, now radiated warmth, history, and purpose. He knew that the work was never truly done. There would always be more stories to uncover, more connections to restore, and more lessons to share. But Daniel also knew that he had found his place, his purpose, and his calling. The cabin had changed everything, for him and for the community. In the years that followed, Daniel continued to nurture the cabin, ensuring that its legacy endured. Families reunited, histories were preserved, and the cabin became a symbol of hope, knowledge, and quiet heroism. The laughter and doubt of those who had mocked him faded into the past, replaced by respect and gratitude. The cabin had taught him that true value is measured not by wealth, but by the impact one leaves on the lives of others. In the end, Daniel realized that the cabin was not just a building or an inheritance. It was a living testament to kindness, courage, and the power of preserving history. Through its secrets, he had discovered purpose, connection, and meaning. The laughter that once mocked him had been silenced by the truth. The cabin was priceless, and the legacy of Harold and Daniel would continue to touch lives for generations to come.